My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. This week, a conversation with David L. Ulin, editor of the LA Times Book Review, as well as two anthologies of Los Angeles writing, Another City and Writing Los Angeles.
One of the reasons that reading has become marginalized in the larger culture, which I do think reading has become marginalized in the larger culture, despite not being quite sure that I believe there's a crisis in publishing. One of the reasons that I think reading has become marginalized in the larger culture is that there is this idea on the part of certain readers that reading is somehow better and smarter, and I think that we kind of tap into that notion at our own peril, because it pushes people away, both because they're, I think, put off by the elitism, and also because they feel that it's too hard for them to do. And I think in the end, it's to all of our detriment, and it's all of our peril to operate that way, because we will end up marginalizing ourselves out of business, and more to the point, marginalizing ourselves out of the culture.
Find our complete interview archive on the website, colinmarshallradio.com, or subscribe on iTunes. Open it up and search for the Marketplace of Ideas. My guest is David L. Ulin, editor of the LA Times Book Review, as well as two anthologies of Los Angeles writing, Another City and Writing Los Angeles. He's also the author of a book on earthquake prediction, The Myth of Solid Ground. David, welcome to the Marketplace of Ideas.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is the first time we've had on the show an editor of one of the big three Sunday book review sections, and book reviewing has also been a huge topic of the show. But what I wanted to get is a sense of a day in the working life of a Sunday book review editor. What challenges do you face?
It's a variable thing. It changes from day to day. I don't think there's a typical day, although there are certainly typical aspects of the day. Largely, I think the real challenge for me is keeping enough ahead so that we can give reviewers the time they need to read a book and think about it and write a review, and yet also be able to run the review in a timely way. So we really are, although it's December now that I'm speaking to you, I'm thinking already late January into February in terms of the books I'm looking at, in terms of what I'm assigning, and trying to make sure that the schedule works out. And it makes for a very strange kind of double vision. Sometimes I actually forget where I am in time.
How accurate is your vision into the future of the LA Times Book Review? Do you know exactly what's in your mind, what's going to come out of the presses that far ahead?
Not exactly. I mean, I plan out issues. In the first place, one of the things that we do is we not only handle the Sunday book review, that is the book review staff. When I say we not only handle the Sunday book review, but we also assign the daily book reviews that run in the daily paper. So we're looking at a couple of different things. And yes, we plan out a schedule of what we think are likely to be the reviews that we're covering in the daily paper and what the various Sunday issues look like. But then when they come up in the cycle, sometimes we mix and match. Ads are unpredictable, so we are sort of at the mercy of the ad department in terms of knowing what ads we're going to have to run. Their deadlines run a little later than ours. So often we're kind of maneuvering things around here and there, pulling some stuff out, dropping some things in. Or, frankly, we may stumble across something that we missed or have a reviewer pitch us something that we like, and that fits with some other pieces that we've got assigned, and we'll drop them in. But I try to think of it in terms of about 75% fixed, and then give us about 25% of leeway to play around and have a little bit of kind of serendipity or improvisation in how we put the sections together.
Is that a similar ratio to how you do your own job, 75% planning, 25% improvisation?
When you say my own job, you mean in terms of what?
The editor of the Sunday book review and of the book reviews that run during the week.
I think, yes, I think that's probably a fairly accurate thing. I mean, I think you have to be, obviously it's a big machine, I mean, we're running something between the Sunday and the daily and the occasional features that we run as well, and we also are doing some web-only stuff. We're reviewing somewhere in the range of about 1,000 books a year. So that's a lot. So I think you need planning, or else it just falls into chaos. But I think if it's too rigidly planned and mapped out, then you lose some kind of pulse or heartbeat in some way. And I think, when I write, I try to have a similar approach. I try and go in with a kind of map in my mind of what I'm looking for, but I also want to be open to the kind of associations that pop up in the course of the process. And I think that that's just my general sensibility. So yes, that is sort of how I think in terms of, I want to have a pretty good sense of what's coming, but I also want to leave a couple of open spaces so that if something emerges on me that I wasn't expecting, that looks really interesting, or by the same token, if a piece comes in that doesn't work and we need to either give it more time to go back to a reviewer and ask for rewrites, or, in certain cases it simply doesn't work and we end up not using it, I want to be able to have the flexibility to deal with those possibilities when they emerge.
And I wanted to talk about the difference between the books that you're going to be covering in the book review and in the daily reviews, and the books that, as you said, grab the attention at the last moment. Now, what books in your mind must be reviewed?
Well, let me backtrack for a minute. It's important to think about what your sort of audience and publishing focus is, and we're part of a daily newspaper. So I think that we have an obligation to look at books in a variety of ways. And one way, which I think is really endemic to the newspaper culture of book coverage, is to look at books as news. So, for instance, there are a lot of books that come out. I'm thinking of books, say, like the Robert Draper book on George Bush that came out a few months ago, or the George Tenet book, or this new biography of Condoleezza Rice that was just published, or for that matter, the new Stephen King novel that's coming out in January, that we absolutely, as a daily newspaper, it's part of our purview to cover those books. Those are the books that are part of the kind of broad, general conversation in the culture, and we're responsible to sort of participate in that conversation, I think. But I also think that we're responsible for helping to kind of steer the conversation, particularly about books. And so while we're going to look at those books, and then in terms of more literary choices, obviously the new Philip Roth novel, of course we're going to review that. We did review that. The Dennis Johnson novel, of course we were going to review that. We did review that. Of course, the David McKellis biography of Charles Schulz and Peanuts, that was and the Alice Sebald novel, or those are books that we're absolutely going to cover without any question. I mean, those are major books in the literary culture, and that too is part of our job. But I also think that once you kind of move beyond those books, then it really becomes a matter of what is interesting to us as a section, and what is interesting to each of us as editors and writers. Because we're I think of us as a kind of regional section with a national sensibility, and I feel that we sort of have to straddle those two things. And I think that's particularly important in light of being in Southern California, because Southern California is even now not really regarded seriously across the country as a literary landscape or as a community of writing and literature. And part of our charge, I think, as the LA Times and as the LA Times Book Review, is to talk about our literary culture, because nobody else is. And I think it's to their detriment, because there's some really incredible and important writing coming out of this area. So, for instance, recently we have reviewed Judith Freeman's book, The Long Embrace, which is a kind of odd, impressionistic, and quite wonderful book about Raymond Chandler and his relationship with his wife. We put Steve Erickson's novel, Zeroville, on the cover because Erickson is, I think, a hugely important writer nationally, and I think he's actually starting to get that attention finally. But he's certainly a hugely important writer regionally, and he's exactly the kind of person we would put on the cover. We covered Bill Boyarsky's biography of Jesse Unruh, who was a California state politician, very influential in the 70s and 80s, because that too is our story as a kind of as a regional, as a major paper in the region. That too, those are our kinds of stories. So those are things that we look at, and then we fill in where we have room, and we actually do have a fair amount of room given the number of books we're reviewing. We look for other things that we want to draw people's attention to just because they interest us. We try to review poetry when we can. We try to review first fiction when we can. I think it's also, from my bent, very important for us to be reviewing fiction. There's been a real trend over the last several years in terms of Sunday newspaper book reviews to review less fiction and review more nonfiction. I think this is a real error. So we have gone out of our way over the last couple of years to try and reverse that, at least in terms of the Times, and really spend a lot of time talking about contemporary fiction.
That's what I call a comprehensive answer. You've touched on a lot of stuff that I want to mention. And what I want to ask you first about what you just said is the breakdown with the local and the national and global literary scenes. Is that a 50-50 in your mind for the book review, or?
It's not that programmatic. I think for me it's more of a kind of intuitive thing, a sort of I know it when I see it kind of deal. And I also want to stress that it's not just in terms of covering local writers or books about local history or local figures, biographies of local figures and those kind of things. I mean, certainly that's part of it. But it's also, I think, in terms of a kind of, for want of a better phrase, local sensibility, which is a vague and amorphous thing that I can't explain in any less vague or less amorphous way, again, except to say that I know it when I see it. Whether that means using reviewers from Southern California, which we don't exclusively, but we do use a lot of reviewers from Southern California, whether that means kind of trying to mix and match so that, for instance, if we have, I'll try and assign books by people not from California to California critics and maybe try and assign books by California writers to critics who are not from California as a way of kind of crossing sensibilities. I think it's really it's just a matter of kind of feel and touch in some way as to sort of what the balance is.
The books that you know you're going to cover and the books that get covered because they pop up, as you said, during the 11th hour. What are those books that come to your attention later? What make them coverage worthy in your mind?
Again, it's there is no science to it, or there is a science to it, but it's a kind of intuitive science, I suppose. So let me give you an example. I mean, we recently, Pierre Bayard's book, How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read, which interested me for a variety of reasons. I wasn't sure we were going to review it. And then in the course of, in the course of thinking about it and having a conversation with someone who writes for me, the book came up and she had a very interesting approach, and so we went ahead with a review. That's a book, we may or may not have reviewed that, but the way that the book was going to be written about seemed very interesting, and so that evolved. Actually, just this past Sunday, we had Will Self, who's just published a book on psychogeography, which is a kind of engaged form of walking or travel, let's say. He just reviewed a book for us. It's called America from the Air, and it's a collection of photographs taken from the air, tracing plane routes across the continent of the United States. And because Self is really fundamentally interested in geography and how it affects personality and what our relationship to place is, he seemed an obvious guy to review this book. This is the kind of book we might not have reviewed, frankly, if we hadn't had someone who could bring a certain sensibility and a certain kind of wit to the project. But in that instance, we reviewed that book because we thought, and I think accurately, given the piece that came out, that it would make a really interesting piece of writing. That's the other thing, too, is to think about the fact that we're not just constructing a book review as a kind of set of book reports or as a buyer's guide, although I do think that, again, given the purview of the newspaper, part of our function is to say, this is worth your time and worth your money, because books cost a lot of money. But we're also trying to put together a section that reads well as a kind of publication in its own right, because I think many people read reviews and don't actually go out and read the books, or may not want to read the books or get enough about the book from the review. And I want the reviews, the individual reviews, and the review itself as a kind of object to function as a discrete reading experience.
This is something you said a little bit earlier. I wanted to come back to that. You were mentioning the task of matching reviewers to books. Mm-hmm. And how long, or I guess that's not a great way to put it, but how do you learn that? How do you learn that instinct? How have you learned it?
Again, I think partly just through experience. I think I edited a book section at a weekly paper in Los Angeles, the LA Reader, for 3.5 years in the 90s. And I also have reviewed for many years, and known reviewers. So I've talked a lot with people about books. So in that sense, I think I have a pool of writers who I know fairly well, and I know what their sensibilities are and what their interests are. I also have a really good crew of editors I work with. I have 4 editors I work with on the book review, all of whom have their own kind of connections and writers they work with and their own sensibilities. And a lot of times we'll just sit around and bat ideas back and forth. We have a weekly staff meeting, and we'll sit and say, okay, this book is out, who should review it, and we'll throw names around, and there's a quality of brainstorming that I think is really useful. And sometimes names come up where, not names that any one of us might have come up with on our own, but in the kind of critical mass of the room, someone's name comes up and we're all like, yeah, that's the guy.
There's kind of a collective instinct that this is going to be the person to review this book.
Yeah, and then sometimes it's individual. Sometimes I'll come up with something, or sometimes one of the other editors will come in and say, hey, I think so-and-so ought to review this book, and you think, yes, that's exactly who ought to review this book. And sometimes a book comes across your desk and either, for instance, we have writers who cover various beats, just like any other section of the newspaper would. We've got a couple of writers who write about let's see. We have a number of writers who would write about rock and roll or music. We have a couple of writers who write about theater. If we were going to do something, either say a biography of a theater figure or plays or whatever, we have some writers who write about poetry. A number of writers who write about fiction in different ways. Some writers who write about are very specialized in terms of postmodern experimental types of fiction. So if a book like that comes down the pike and we want it reviewed, we have a group of writers we would think of. I think it's, again, part of it is intuitive. Part of it is simply I've been here for 2.5 years, which isn't a vast amount of time, but it's been long enough to build up what I think of as a very reliable and stable crew of writers who I can count on to deliver good work, but also whose sensibilities I think I know. So when certain books come in, I just have a sense this is a good choice for this reviewer.
How does the team handle when this sort of thing gets a little bit problematic? Like, let's say a major national release comes out and a name is thrown out of a reviewer who would write a very entertaining piece on the book, but let's say you also know that reviewer will just absolutely tear the book apart savagely, a book that might not deserve that kind of treatment, but it would be an entertaining article. How do you approach that? How do you deal with that sort of situation? Do you not pick that reviewer then, or what's the conflict
I
like?
wouldn't take that review. I don't want to know going in. Actually, let me put it a different way. I don't ever assign a book looking for a negative review, although I'm not at all concerned or shy about publishing negative reviews. In fact, I think it's one of the essential roles of a book review section is to publish negative reviews. Again, not to generate controversy or not to sort of play politics, but because I think that part of the discussion of books and of anything in the culture has to do with positives and negatives. There are things that we really respond to and like, and there are things that we think are problematic and have issues with. And I think that part of the kind of critical integrity of the section relies on having that back and forth and publishing negative reviews, and in fact, some very hard negative reviews, which we've done, also of major books. But I don't want to assign books. No, I don't want to know what a reviewer thinks going in. I'm very wary of that. I want to have the reviewer interact with the book and see what kind of things come up. And a lot of times, even if I know a reviewer would love a book, I might not send it to them because I feel like I may not get a fully engaged kind of interaction with a book. Again, not that I wouldn't want to run a rave review of a book, and we certainly do those as well. But if I feel like I know what a reviewer is going to say, positively or negatively, then that, to me, is a reason actually not to assign the book to that reviewer, because I feel like I'm not going to get anything interesting or meaty or engaged. I feel like the reviewer may have already made up their mind about that writer or that book before they even begin to read the book, and then they won't be taking the book on its own merits or lack thereof, if that's the way they feel. And I also am really opposed to the gratuitous slam as a concept. Again, I'm not opposed to the non-gratuitous slam, but I think if a reviewer comes in with an agenda, then I've got a problem with that.
There's an avoidance of a bland angle to be taken by a review. Like, you don't want the quick and easy positive review or the quick and easy negative review. You'll want something that's going to be a little more complicated?
I want something that's going to be a little more complicated. I want the reviewer to work. And I don't mean that I think most reviewers want to work. I think it's more interesting for them to want to work. I want them to be challenged. I think it's a better reading experience. For me as a reader, I feel like I can tell, I'm not just talking about reviews now, but about any kind of writing. I feel like I can tell when a writer is having to think and work something out, and for me that makes for the most interesting reading experience. So I'd like to publish reviews that operate in that way as well.
You want to see that the writer is thinking. What else do you look for in criticism?
well, that's the first thing that the writer is thinking. I do look for a writer who is sort of steeped in the material. I want someone who knows the territory they're writing about, again, whether it's a writer's career or whether it's an area of inquiry or historical period or something like that. I think that I also look for elegant writing. That's a key factor. I don't often go to full-time professional critics, but more writers who also are critics, because I like the writerly sensibility. My sense of what reviews are supposed to do is that they're a response to a book rather than a kind of critical dissection of a book. I'm not running an autopsy room. And I think that I want that kind of conversational but yet very smart and writerly response. I want the writer of the review to actually almost write an essay about what it was like to read this book and what the book made them think about and how it worked or didn't from their point of view, but as part of that reading experience. I want the review to evoke the reading experience. As we went over before, there's the Sunday book review, and there are the daily book reviews as well. And then, of course, there's the online component, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but this sort of three-pronged model. What's the difference between the reviews, say, that make it into the Sunday book review or the ones that go in the paper during the week? Well, I think, there's less difference now than there used to be, and that's been a conscious process, actually, to kind of blur the line a little bit. One of the great concerns I had when I came in was the perception, rightly or wrongly, on the part of readers that the daily book reviews were somehow outtakes and B-sides that didn't make that they didn't make the cut to make the album. And I never thought that. And I actually think that the daily review, I write them a fair amount as well. It's a great form. It's somewhat different than the Sunday form in terms of being a little less essayistic and a little kind of quicker and off the cuff, which can be very fun from a writing point of view. But I also think that it's important to blur those lines. And so what we've been doing is, in the last 6 or 8 months, have been trying to run bigger pieces in the daily, pieces that you wouldn't necessarily think of as a daily piece, but that are more, that might appear to be more Sunday pieces as part of it. And then also, as I say, some of these other, some pieces, some smaller books, a lot of newsworthy books. I mean, one of the things that we've done is a lot of the books that come off the news, again, say that Condoleezza Rice biography that I was talking about earlier, that we ran as a daily review because it was a very news-oriented book for obvious reasons. We also ran the George Tenet book that I was talking about, the Bob Woodward book. Those were all daily. So a lot of stuff that's kind of current events-y and that seems to fit into the news vision of a daily newspaper will run there. But other than that, it's kind of, it depends on what fits. It depends on sort of what we want to shake up. We're also trying to frame these things. Again, I think of the dailies like each week as a sort of set of reviews, so we're trying to kind of come up with a good mix for the week so that if you sit down and read the paper every day and read our reviews on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc., you're not getting 6 novels or you're not getting 6 books of current events or whatever. But you get a nice kind of ebb and flow. So a lot of it depends on, what we have and then how it fits with other things. What, to your mind, are the advantages of a freestanding book review section, one that sits there in the middle of the paper as opposed to, say, a regular paper section, or, as you've mentioned, the reviews within the rest of the paper? Well, it's an interesting question, because as you know, our freestanding book review section got combined with the opinion section in April, which it is now currently combined with. Although it's still an independent section, the two sections share space, but they're not merged exactly. They're both editorially independent of each other. My sense of the value of a freestanding book section is that it's a community center in some way. It's a virtual community, but it's a community nonetheless. It's a place where we can get together through the medium of the section and discuss books each week, and it's dedicated in that sense. I think that's a really useful thing. I also think, though, that there are advantages to both the idea that the section may exist within the context of the larger paper, and then in terms of the daily reviews, the fact that the reviews are sitting in a section that isn't dedicated to books, because I think there's a serendipity factor that's really important. And one of the potential drawbacks of a standalone section of any sort is that if you're not interested in the subject, you don't pick up the section. If you're not interested in business, you don't read the business section. If you're not interested in opinions, you don't read the opinion section. If you're not interested in books, you don't read the book section. So I think there's a kind of back and forth and ebb and flow there. I like the idea of having a dedicated space because I think that's an important there's an important critical mass that goes on there. If you are interested in books, then you get 10, 12 reviews in one place, or, a couple of essays and a bunch of reviews or whatever, and they've hopefully been selected in a way that makes sense so that there's a kind of conversation going on throughout the issue. For instance, last Sunday we put a history of the American Transcendentalist movement on the cover, and then within the section we also had sort of somewhat related pieces, a big piece on the poetry of Philip Whalen and Joanne Kiger, who in many ways I would characterize as contemporary transcendentalists, and so hopefully there was a kind of sort of theoretical through line that ran through the section, and you can have a broader conversation and look at 10 books and how they relate to each other. That's a really valuable thing. I also think it's equally valuable to look at one book within the context of the larger culture and how that book fits in with film and music and theater and all sorts of other things.
A spreading across of media, then.
Exactly.
Now, in April, when the book review section and the opinion section were folded together, there was also an increase in online content and the blog jacket copy. How has the adaptation process gone? How has content adapted to this change in form?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I think a little more slowly than I would like. We're all, I include myself in this as well, we're all print-based people, so we've been learning the online environment, which has been very interesting. I think that in terms of, there are two factors at work. One is in terms of the web-only content, which are the 4 columns that we're running on the blog. And I think that the columns are, to my mind, are essentially print columns transposed to the web, where, they're 900 to 1,000 words on a fixed idea. They could easily run as print columns. And in fact, that was part of the idea, was to sort of see what it would be like to sort of to put a kind of print concept up there. The blog, I think, has started to find its own voice in some way. I feel like, again, it took us a while to sort of figure out what blogs can do. I think you're talking about a group of writers and editors. So in the early months, I would say that the blog was probably overwritten, that we were tending to write entries almost as little essays as opposed to just sort of throwing stuff out there lately. And I think, actually, to be frank, it took us a while to learn the value, or to actually really get our minds inside the whole concept of linking and hypertext. So I think that as we've started to do that, the blog's grown a little bit more informal and off the cuff, and I'd like to see it continue in that direction. I think we're going to try and do some more online-only stuff as time progresses, whether in the form of another round of columns or even some web-only features and pieces of writing, just to see how that would work. I mean, the issue for my end is it's always going to be about the writing, and one of the things that I'm interested in terms of the web is how does the web support writing? I don't believe for a second that all online writing has to be 200 words long. And yet I'm also aware of the whole notion of screens and reading on screens and what the idea of how people read online. So I'm curious about how to kind of play with that. And I don't really know the answer to that, but it's interesting. The other thing that the website's done that I'm really happy with is that prior to the sections coming together and the sort of increased focus on our web presence, the book's web presence was really catch as catch can on the paper's website. And as a result of the last several months, we now have a dedicated books website, or web homepage, where we're gathering not only the Sunday and the daily book reviews, but we're gathering all of the book features and all the book news, all the book-related stories from across the paper every day. And that, to me, has been really invaluable, not just as an archival thing, although partly that, but in a way, as a first step in what we're ultimately hoping will be a kind of online books magazine, of the Times book coverage, and can function that way, where you can read features, you can read essays, you can read commentary, you can read reviews, you can read interviews, and it's all there for you. I think we need to do some things with the design of it, which is definitely on our radar screen for the new year. But I think that the basic building blocks of it are starting to fall into place.
That concept of the online book magazine sounds extremely appealing to me, and I'm thinking about some of the advantages touted of the online formats. In a lot of areas, you'll see book journalists a little bit frightened of the looming threat of the bloggers with their reviews and online sites giving away the store for free, essentially putting all those reviews out there. But there's less fear I'm getting from you and more of a sense of experimentation, and that's good to see.
I think it's experimentation. I don't buy this whole book. I mean, there are a couple of big myths floating around right now that I completely don't buy into at all. One is the crisis in publishing, which, I mean, there's always been a crisis in publishing in some sense. I don't think that that online is the cause of any kind of crisis in publishing. I think literacy is an issue, but I don't think that that's necessarily related to the web or to computers. And in fact, I think that the web and computers may be tools that increase reading and increase literacy, because for whatever else they are, for whatever else it is, the internet is still fundamentally text-based medium. And so I think that that's something that's very worth looking into. I don't think readers are going anywhere. I think delivery systems are changing, and it's a very interesting and kind of fluid moment to be standing here. I don't know. I mean, 5 years from now, maybe we'll be in a crisis, depending on how certain things play out. But at the moment, I think we're at a moment of possibility, and I'd like to see more embrace of that possibility. And if you listen to the really smart people in publishing, people like Michael Peach at Little Brown, or James Atlas, who's got his own imprint, Atlas and Company, or Jonathan Galassi for R. Strauss, they're all saying the same thing. That, basically, look, it's a transition moment, and there are a number of really exciting possibilities about how writing and reading continue to survive and grow, and I firmly believe that. I also think, though, that this whole book review blogger thing is just, on every level has become entirely self-serving BS in many ways. I think, that there is no book review blogger issue from my point of view. If you look at the fact that, if you look at, I mean, it's an old argument, I think, but if you look at how many bloggers are reviewing, not just on their own blogs, but have started reviewing for us, for the Post, for the New York Times, for Philadelphia Inquirer, for the San Francisco Chronicle, across the board, right? Baltimore Sun. There are people who started as bloggers, let's say, or who continue to be bloggers, who have, fluidly go back and forth between print and online, without a second thought. And again, if you look at newspapers and the way that online is becoming an increasing part of the way newspapers operate, both in terms of multimedia, in terms of news coverage, but also even in the book sections, where we have a blog. Dwight Garner's doing his blog at the New York Times. I think the Washington Post has just started a blog. Now, these are, there are, I think some people do things better than others. There are certain bloggers who I think are better at writing about books than others. There are certain book sections, frankly, that I think are better at writing about books than others. I don't think that the medium in any way is a determining factor for the quality of the thought and the coverage. I think there are people on both sides of the line, both the blog side and the print side, who, for whatever reason, like to ride the book review blog thing. And I think in many cases it's self-rewarding. But I think if you really look at the issues, there is no issue. What we're all talking about is reading is good, books are great, literature is important. How do we have a broad-based conversation that includes as many people as possible on the most intelligent levels as possible? And from my point of view, anyone who's asking that question is on my side.
If you're just tuning in, my guest is David L. Ulin, editor of the Los Angeles Times Book Review, as well as 2 anthologies of L.A. writing, Another City, and Writing Los Angeles. This crisis in publishing that you mention and deny, how closely does this relate to what has been termed the crisis in book reviewing, an idea set off by your predecessor, Steve Wasserman's article recently in the Columbia Journalism Review, Goodbye to All That? What are your thoughts on if there is a crisis in specifically reviewing?
I don't really think there's a crisis in reviewing. I think, yes, newspaper, I think, first of all, I think there are a lot of kind of specific areas of reviewing that kind of tend to get swept together into the center of the room when you talk about a crisis in reviewing. And there's a fundamental difference between what the Los Angeles Times Book Review is doing or is supposed to do and what Entertainment Weekly is doing and what the New York Review of Books is doing and what Book Forum is doing. And I think all of these things are valid parts of the conversation about books. I think in the first place, there's a fundamental misperception that short is worse on the one side and a fundamental misperception that long is worse on the other side. Again, I don't think length has anything to do with it or space has anything to do with it. It's the acuity of the thinking and the quality of the criticism. And I have read profoundly brilliant 800-word reviews. I mean, look at the work of A.S. Byatt, who had turned the 800-word book review into an art form. I've read profoundly awful 800-word reviews. And by the same token, I've read brilliant 6,000-word essays on books in the New York Review or in book form. Well, actually, I think book form's max length is 4,000 words, but brilliant extended essays on books. And I've also read, self-indulgent, turgid, unreadable extended essays on books. It really depends on who's doing the writing and who's doing the thinking. And I don't think that length or format has much to do with that. I do think that it can be frustrating, to try and write about a big subject in a short space. And I think that that's an issue. But I also think that, I'm in a lucky position where I have enough editorial space that if I want to run a piece of 2,000, 2,500 words, I can do it. And it won't eat up all of my space. I think where you really start to run into problems in terms of newspaper sections is where you look at, say, what's going on at certain newspapers where they've cut their book sections so close to the bone that they're only running a handful of capsule reviews, and I think that becomes a sort of diminishment that is very difficult to overcome. Again, no knock on capsule reviews, we run them, but I think that you need to have a balance between sort of long and short and smaller. Some books you can pretty much get at a book in a 300-word capsule. Here's a taste. See what you think. Some books you need a longer space to really get into the intricacies of it, and I think that. So I don't know that I'm actually answering the question. To me, it's a matter of, is there enough space to give the book the treatment it requires? That's the fundamental question, more than, is a long piece better than a short piece? I think a good long piece is better than a bad short piece, but a good short piece is better than a bad long piece.
One of the professional themes that I'm hearing from you here, and you can tell me if I'm off base at all here, is that brilliance in criticism transcends all specs, all media, all sizes.
I think that's right. I think, and I think the engagement as a writer transcends all of that as well. And that's what we should be talking about, rather than whether one delivery system is better than the other or whether one form of writing is better than the other. I also think this whole notion of better or good or bad is a little amorphous and tricky, because who is really to say? Who's the determining voice here? This is, these are very subjective terms we're playing around with, and I think that we need to recognize them as subjective. Not to say that we shouldn't be subjective in what our own aesthetics and sensibilities are, but I don't think there's a definitive answer one way or the other.
Do you think maybe clear thought would be a good substitute for brilliance in the thing I just said?
Clear thought. I'm all in favor of brilliance. It's rare to find, but I'm all in favor of it. And whenever it comes my way, I try to make sure to put it in the section.
Yeah, that's a good move on your part, I think. And I wanted to talk about one more element of the online presence that the book review now has, and that is the much-touted reader feedback. Has there been a boost in the interaction with readers, the conversation between the publication and readers?
Again, to be perfectly honest, in terms of the book section, less than I would like. And I think that that's partly our responsibility in terms of not making it sort of overt and clear enough about how to do it. And I think it partly may have to do with the nature of our audience and the people who read books or who read about books. I think that there are certain hot-button pieces that generate an enormous amount of commentary. For instance, we ran an essay a couple of weeks ago in which Laura Miller wrote about the Catholic League and the sort of protests about Philip Pullman's The Golden Compass, about the film The Golden Compass, and relating it back to the book of The Golden Compass. And we got I think over 300 responses on a comment board. I have to say, pretty interesting and largely thoughtful responses, although there were some of the sort of usual knee-jerk reactions on both sides. But I also think that one of the things I've noticed, and I noticed this when I was, throughout my career as a reviewer, is you don't get that much mail. Books generate a lot of passion. But book readers or book review readers, in my experience at least, for some reason, aren't the type of readers who generally write in that much. You get a few things here and there, but not that much. And I've been surprised. For instance, we ran a piece a couple of weeks ago on the cover where we sort of reassessed Charles Bukowski and his work, which in Los Angeles, I thought, I wasn't a concern, but I was aware of the idea that as that piece was going through the process, that we could get a lot of mail or a lot of email, a lot of comments, and we didn't get that much. And I wonder whether that's because readers, book readers, or the people who read book sections just don't. They engage with the ideas. They're having a conversation with you while they're reading your piece, and maybe they disagree with you or agree with you, and they talk about it with their friends, but I'm not sure that they write in.
They won't take it one step further and have the actual conversation?
I don't know. I also think that there is a sense, and again, this may be the newspaper part of it, that there is on the part of our print readers, and I don't know what the age demographics are, that they may be reluctant to go online. I mean, I don't know that. I mean, I think we're drawing, I wonder, and I'm not sure what the answer to this is, I'm just sort of thinking aloud here, whether we're drawing from two different readerships, one in print and one online, and how much those two readerships overlap. I don't know the answer to that question.
Is one of your goals to break down the insularity of the book community and to just connect books to society as a whole?
Yes, fundamentally one of my goals is that, to break down that insularity, and also I think to break down what I would consider to be, let's say, elitist strategies within the book community. I mean, I think that, for instance, I'm fundamentally interested in eclipsing the line between literature and genre fiction, for instance. Or maybe that's a little bit strong, I guess. But I think that in a lot of cases, there's a lot of labeling that goes on and a lot of categorization that goes on within the book community, partly because it makes things easier. It's a lot easier to market a book if you can slap a label on it so that people can clearly identify what it is right away. It's a lot easier to, frankly, review a book if you can categorize it in some way. It gives you a frame from which to build your criticism. But I think in many cases, and increasingly as literary writers, quote-unquote literary writers, use genre tropes or integrate genre styles. You know, Erickson, a great example, who brings in elements of science fiction and pulp fiction into his very literary fiction. Or as quote-unquote genre writers, people like Walter Mosley, let's say, use literary techniques and build characters. I mean, I would make an argument that Mosley's E.Z. Rollins books are as fine a kind of fictional evocation of Los Angeles as anyone's produced. So I'm interested in kind of stripping away those kind of, to me, they're sort of self-fulfilling categories, and I don't know that they're really meaningful anymore. So I think that it's a twofold process. One is within the book community. I'm very interested in getting people to look at the books for what they are, as what they are, without trying to impose some kind of external labeling system on them. And secondly, in terms of the book community's insularity within the larger culture, I think it's a self-defeating idea. And I think that one of the reasons that reading has become marginalized in the larger culture, which I do think reading has become marginalized in the larger culture, despite not being quite sure that I believe there's a crisis in publishing. One of the reasons that I think reading has become marginalized in the larger culture is that there is this idea on the part of certain readers that reading is somehow better and smarter, and I think that we kind of tap into that notion at our own peril, because it pushes people away, both because they're, I think, put off by the elitism, and also because they feel that it's too hard for them to do. And I think in the end, it's to all of our detriment and it's all of our peril to operate that way, because we will end up marginalizing ourselves out of business, and more to the point, marginalizing ourselves out of the culture.
I'm very glad to hear you say all that, because I share a lot of those goals, and especially doing this show, which is primarily about books. There's book guest after book guest after book guest, and one of the things that I too often find myself kind of ranting about to friends is also, and tell me if you agree about this, is the siege mentality of the book reader, people referring to themselves as capitalized first letters, people who read, and that there's an ever-closing circle of barbarians around them and that they have to defend their patch of land. It's not exactly elitism, although I recognize that there is elitism, but it's just it's kind of a despair. And is that something you see as well?
I mean, it's interesting. I don't know. I would call it a Garrison mentality. But yes, I do. I don't see it all the time, but I see it enough. And actually, interestingly enough, I think that certainly among the readers that I know, it's much less prevalent than it used to be. I remember 20 years ago, Madison Smart Bell wrote an essay, I think, in Antaeus, or maybe it was in Conjunctions, I can't remember, but it was something about the notion that detective fiction could be literature too. And it was this kind of thing where a lot of people I knew were like, oh my God, this is a radical statement. How could, I've never thought about this. And I think that 20 years ago, there were still a lot of people who cared about reading fundamentally who had maybe not confronted those kinds of ideas. Now I think everyone's confronted that idea. It's not an uncommon idea. You might agree with it, you might disagree with it, but it's an idea that's out there in the culture. And when I listen to discussions or read discussions of genre fiction, one of the ways in which people are talking about it is in that way. Is it, about the question of it, whether it's literature or whether it's not. Whereas 20 years ago, there would have been a whole group of people who would have taken it on faith that it could never have been literature. And I think that's a step in the right direction. It's a little slow, I think, the process, but I think it's slowly kind of opening up.
Your predecessor, again, Steve Wasserman, at the book review, he was routinely slammed with charges of elitism. And was that something that made you fearful, made you deliberately avoid things that might be considered elitist when you took the helm?
No, I mean, I think I think you could argue that actually, none of that really played into anything at all. I just simply brought my own sensibility to the section in the same way that Steve brought his sensibility to the section. And there are ways in which I think our sensibilities overlap. I mean, I've known Steve for many years, and we talk about books all the time, or when we see each other. And I think that there are definitely areas in which our sensibilities overlap, and in which the section hasn't changed, whether in terms of some of the reviewers that we're using, or reviewers who wrote under Steve, and some of the books are the same kinds of books. But I think that one of the things about publications that's interesting, and it's really interesting from the point of view of the editor, I think I was aware of this as a reader and a writer, but I'm much more aware of it now, is that publications take on the personalities of the people who edit them. And so there isn't really a publication personality. I mean, there is, obviously, because it has its own identity, but there is a way in which they take on those personalities. So when I came in, I wasn't really concerned with much of anything except what I felt was important and what I felt would make the kind of book review I'd want to put together and edit. And so that's what I was really looking for. I wasn't trying to react one way or the other to anybody who had either come before me or after me, or frankly to anyone anywhere. I really had a sense of this is what I think we need to be talking about, and so let's talk about it.
How, in your opinion, is the book review different when imbued with David Ulin's personality rather than Steve Wasserman's?
Well, I think you'd have to ask other readers about that. I think, again, what I would say in terms of how it's imbued with my personality is a lot of what we've been discussing here. I think I would say, and I sort of hesitate to say anything about it because I feel like I'm opening myself up to as a target to readers who don't agree. But I would say I hope it's a fairly serious, or even strip away fairly, I hope it's a serious consideration of books and literature each week that looks at literature and fiction and poetry, but also looks at, books, nonfiction books on culture, cultural criticism, ideas. And that, I mean, one of the things that I've really tried to imbue it with, because it's how I feel about books, is a kind of enthusiasm. Because I feel like, in the end, we're all readers first, no matter what we started at. I mean, no matter what we become, we all started as readers. And I still feel an excitement, an enormous excitement, looking at the books that come in each day. I look at every book that comes in because it's just like a kid in a candy store in many ways, and looking for the really cool find. What is the book that we are going to find that has never been found before? What's the really exciting thing that somebody's going to do that I haven't seen before? And by the same token, what's J.M. Coetzee's new book going to be? Because I'm really curious about that as well. That's another kind of find. And I think that kind of curiosity and enthusiasm is what I'd like this book review to put across.
The finding of the cool, something that may not be anywhere else, may not be on the cover of the other book reviews, but you'd like to find something for the LA Times book review that's different?
Well, I don't know. That's not exactly it. I mean, yes, that always, of course. But I think really for me, the thing that just makes me want to jump and shout. And it may be something that everybody else is covering, or it may be something that nobody else is covering. That's less important to me. For instance, I was really intrigued a couple of months ago by these new the main new translation, but there was a second one also, these two new translations of War and Peace. Now, that's a novel. It's hard to say that that's new, or exciting in the sense of the fact that we don't all know about War and Peace. But I thought that was really interesting. I wanted to read the new translation. I wanted to get someone to write a really interesting piece about translation and the way it affects the way we read, and to look at both versions of the book. I thought it was fascinating that there were two different versions of War and Peace that were being published almost simultaneously, one of an early draft and one of the final book, the one that's been out in the culture. So what does this mean? I don't know. Is this really interesting? Because I also think that writing and reading is inherently subjective in a lot of ways, and translation brings this out, right? Because we're not reading War and Peace. I'm not reading War and Peace. I don't know how to read Russian. So my experience of War and Peace is inevitably filtered through the sensibility of whoever it is who translates the book. And every time somebody translates the book, they translate it differently, and they're offering me essentially a different take on the book. So what does that mean in terms of how we process information, how we take stories? I think readers translate stories themselves every time they read it. My experience of let's say we've both read the Steve Erickson novel. My experience of the Steve Erickson novel and your experience of the Steve Erickson novel, even though we both read them in English, in the language in which it was written, are going to be two very different things because we translate them to fit our own experience. And it seemed to me that translation question became a really interesting metaphor for reading and the way that books move us or don't, and how we interact with literature. And so that, to me, was the kind of also, now that book got covered widely, or certainly the translation of the finished book got covered widely. But that's not what I'm talking about. That didn't bother me so much. I was really interested in the notion of how do we look at this thing in a way that's fresh and interesting.
This is not so much the search for whatever book is new and exciting, but whatever experience is new and exciting.
Experience, idea, it could be the book, it could be a take on a book, it could be an area of investigation or an area of inquiry, it could be any of these kind of things. That's what I like, the idea of trying to have the section be open to encompass those things when they come to us. And I think it's also important to realize that they don't all the time. I mean, one of the things about putting out a weekly section is that some weeks you have just a very solid group of reviews, and that's what you put out. Some weeks you have something that's unexpected, and you put that in too. There's an ebb and flow from week to week. You sort of, you are at the mercy of the books that are out that week. And sometimes those books are really thrilling and exciting, and sometimes maybe a little less so.
I wanted to go into your personal background a bit. Now, if my army of researchers have this correct, you were born and raised in Manhattan, right?
Yes.
And then you came to New York, or you came from New York to LA in the early 90s, in what, late 20s?
29, yeah.
What did that New York, lifelong to that point perspective give you when you arrived here in LA?
A deep-seated hatred of Los Angeles.
I suspected that's kind of what New Yorkers have. How did you journey past that?
Well, it's funny. I was told when I moved here that there was a 3-year window and that you'd hate it for the first 3 years and then all of a sudden you wouldn't hate it anymore. And in some ways that's exactly what happened. I hated it for 3 years and then I woke up and I realized I didn't hate it. I didn't love it, but I kind of liked it, or I was sort of intrigued by it. I think actually for me the less glib answer is that it was when I stopped comparing it to New York that I began to be able to appreciate Los Angeles on its own terms, and to be able to see that there was a really interesting kind of culture and personality to the city that I was never going to see or be able to understand or experience if I didn't just kind of, again, it's a matter of clearing preconceived notions and ready-made interpretations out of the way, that if I couldn't engage with the city on its own terms and make my judgment of it on its terms, then I was never going to be able to engage with it in a real way.
What terms did you find that LA laid down for you to operate on?
Well, I think, for me at least, and again, this is both subjective and not, because other people have reflected this, I think, as well. It's not an original idea. New York was a city for me with a very clear narrative. Because I think, first of all, there is a very clear narrative of New York. And secondly, I came from a family where all of my grandparents had come to New York in the late early 1900s when they were very young, like, a year, 2 years, 5 years old. And my parents had been raised in New York, and I had been raised on this kind of family narrative of New York as the center of everything. And I don't mean the center of everything in terms of the center of the culture, although that too, but the center of the family. It was a part of the family. It was New York that made the family what it was. So I had a very kind of specific narrative that made sense to me in New York, and part of that too had to do with growing up there. I felt comfortable there. I knew how the city worked. I knew how to get around. I wasn't intimidated by the subway system, those kinds of things. I think that those are little things that we take for granted, but they actually add up to a kind of fundamental emotional connection that's very important in many ways. And then I moved here, and the city didn't make sense to me in any way, shape, or form because there was no public transportation, there was no walking culture. I couldn't find a center to the place. And even, this is a strange thing to say, but even the bad neighborhoods, even the slums had single-family houses with lawns and palm trees and things. And so visually it didn't make sense because I couldn't tell. There were no visual cues that made sense to me in terms of where I was and how I was supposed to behave. So that was fundamental. And then I think once I sort of gave up the comparison to New York, I started to realize that this kind of chaos of Los Angeles, the fact that it doesn't have a center, that's a cliche, but it's also true, and that it doesn't have a defining narrative, it has many different overlapping narratives, that was in its own way a kind of defining narrative, that there was order in the chaos in some way, and that was something that not only I could make sense of, but I'm interested in that whole notion of chaos and order anyway, and the city began to make sense to me on terms that I could understand.
I'm going to ask you this next question in your capacity as the editor of 2 anthologies of LA writing, and that is, what do the qualities of LA bring to its literature?
Well, it's a good question, and I've thought about this a fair amount. I think for me, there's a couple of things. One is I think that it has brought a kind of small-scale personal story, it has allowed the literature of LA to bring a certain small-scale personal story to the fore. One person I think of immediately is Bernard Cooper, whose personal essays, a lot about growing up in Los Feliz and family life, very kind of focused and very specific and very much about what we would consider to be mundane things, family interaction, emerging sexuality, childhood observations, those kinds of things, but really fundamental because that's not what the myth of LA tells us. The myth of LA, which is the Hollywood myth or the noir myth or whatever, is all larger than life, glittery, dangerous, whatever, and within that framework you can lose sight of the fact that this is just a real city where real people live and struggle and go through their lives and, put their kids through school and have to pay their bills and get the car repaired and all those kind of things. So I think that in a city like LA, where the defining myth is so glittery and over the top, the notion that there is a mundane daily life going on is revolutionary. And so that's the one thing. I also think that you have, say, like a writer like Amy Bender and her kind of modern fairy tales, if you want, I don't know what else to call them, which I think are exquisitely beautiful, also come out of that because that is, although they're not personal in the sense of being personal narrative, they're very much a function of her personal sensibility. That's where she's writing like no one else, right? Those stories, nobody's writing stories like that. No one's conceiving of stories like that. And I think that too is a way that kind of personal, I can carve out my little space here and investigate my little postage stamp of land, because the larger story of the city or the larger stories of the city don't have a place for that, so I'm free to explore that. No one else is co-opting that territory. So that's the first thing, and I think that's really fundamental and important in terms of the way that the city infuses itself there. And I think, too, if you look at the city is actually a kind of city of neighborhoods and small communities that are built up, that the whole notion of sprawl, which is interesting and important in its way, but is true, is accurate. But the city itself is a cluster of small communities, and if you can start to look at it on those terms, you start to see the city in a way that it doesn't ordinarily present itself. And I think that the best literature of LA is the work that's doing that.
What do you make of all these debates about the existence of an LA literature, is there or is there not, that goes on?
I think, of course, there is, and I think anyone who's paying attention should see it. I think that it's a sign to me of the city's insecurity about its own intellectual and cultural self that it seems to sort of foment these discussions itself. The city does, that is. I mean, we endlessly have conversations and panel discussions about LA literature. We do it at the Festival of Books. We do it every year. We're probably going to do another LA literature panel this year. When I go to other cities, I don't generally see panel discussions on Chicago literature or San Francisco literature or New York literature. It's taken for granted that these cities have their own literature. Of course they do. And I think that LA has a harder time with that because literature isn't the fundamental creative mechanism by which the city sees itself. Obviously film, and I think visual arts very much, and music. and so that makes literature at least fourth and maybe even lower. So the idea that there are writers out here who aren't writing for Hollywood, who are trying to produce poetry or fiction or essays or narrative or literature, is still a kind of surprising idea, even though I don't think it should be, because how could it be? It's a city or a metropolitan area of 12, 16 million people, of hundreds of different ethnic groups and languages and experiences all brought together. In many ways, it is, I think, a model for the future of how the U.S. and maybe the world and world urban culture is going to work. So, of course, it's a hotbed of stories and narratives and writers. It can't help but be that. I think it's a sign maybe of the city's growing maturation that it's starting to accept that. But the fact that we're still a very young city in terms of our role as an American city, right? I mean, maybe 100 plus years at this point. And I think that as the city grows up, it will become less kind of self-conscious about the fact that it does have a literary culture, and we'll just all accept that, of course, we have a literary culture. How could we not?
And we're running out of time, but I want to ask you one more thing you touched on. What do you hope for the LA literary scene?
That's a great question, and I don't have an easy answer for that. I think, if I were going to, the sort of easy answer for it is that I just would hope that we would all just kind of accept ourselves, or accept that we are here, and sort of feel. I think the LA literary scene could benefit a lot from sort of losing the chip on its shoulder in some way. We're here and look at me, or maybe we're not. The doubt and the chip on its shoulder, I think, is a better way of putting it. And just simply accept we're here. This is the work we're doing, and it does speak to the culture and personality of the city. As to how that happens, I don't know. I mean, as I say, hopefully, partly we can influence that with the review a little bit, in the sense of covering the culture, the literary culture of the city, in terms of reviewing the books, and in terms of talking about LA literature as a kind of valid cultural subject. I think part of it too just simply has to do with time and maturation. I do think cities are organisms in the way that animals and human beings are, and LA, as I said, is a young one. So I think as the city kind of grows into itself a little bit, I hope, will be able to understand itself in more complex terms, and part of that complexity includes the acceptance of a literary life.
Well, David Ulin, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. He also goes under the names Ice Ben and DJ Concept. Check out his website, www.benalthouse, that's BENALTHOUSE.com. Find our complete show archive, our Frapper map, and more on our website, www.colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace.